Kodai Senga has informed the Mets that he'd like to stay, but that does not mean that they're not going to go out and trade him anyway.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to talk about Kodai Senga. He has told the Mets that he wants to stay. I'll talk about that report in the first segment. Second segment, we're going to talk about why the Mets might still move him, which teams would be interested, and what can they get back for Senga. Before in the final segment, we're going to wrap it all up by wondering, is it better off for the Mets to just hold on to Senga for the upside, or should they move on so they can have a different pitcher in their rotation next season? We're going to go through it all, but first, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I'm covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Now, this story that came out today was in The Athletic, written by Will Salmon. Title is Popular Trade Target Kodai Senga told Mets he wants to remain with club, from sources. So Kodai Senga, as many of you know, is on the trade block right now. There was a report that came out earlier this offseason that Senga is, quote, extremely available. I believe Jeff Passan said that in his notes column, that the Mets are actively shopping Senga, and the thought process is, if the Mets are going to add 2 starters to their rotation this offseason, they sort of have to clear one, because you right now already have 5 starting pitchers on the depth chart that should be part of your rotation if none of them get moved. And that's Nolan McLean, obviously, after his great rookie season. He still has another rookie season on the way as he maintained that rookie eligibility. You have Clay Holmes, who's definitely going to be in the rotation. David Peterson, who should be in the rotation, although theoretically they could trade Peterson with 1 year left to control if they really did need to move on from a starter. You have Sean Manaea, a tougher contract to move than Senga. And then you got Senga, who's owed $14 million per season over the next 2 years, with a club option for $15 million in 2028. So that is still a team-friendly deal if you are getting a healthy and effective Kodai Senga. In fact, if he's healthy and effective, that's a steal of a deal. The problem is he has not been healthy, and down the stretch, he was not effective. Here is what the story says about Senga and what he told the Mets. It says, Senga, a popular starting pitcher in the trade market, recently informed the Mets that he preferred to stay with the club as opposed to getting dealt elsewhere, league sources say. After experiencing an injury, poor performance, and a demotion last season, Senga is said to want to reestablish himself as a top starter in the Mets rotation. Senga, who made just 1 start in 2024 because of injuries, feels an obligation to the organization and its fans. Nevertheless, he also understands the business. Continues to say Senga's sentiments, however well-meaning they seem, do not necessarily change the situation. Despite his preference, the Mets still might trade him. And then it mentions how earlier this month, The Athletic reported about Senga tracking trade interest from multiple teams. And also it mentions how Senga has a limited no-trade clause that allows him to block deals to 10 franchises. So we don't know which teams those are. Where does Senga hold that no-trade clause? Because that obviously impacts this conversation. If I'm going to mock in a minute a trade where Kodai Senga ends up on the Orioles, but the Orioles are on his no-trade list, seems like Senga is pretty comfortable with where he's at with the Mets, and he would probably exercise that no-trade clause, if he could. But there's also 20 other teams that you can trade him to if you're just looking to get off of Kodai Senga. And here's what's interesting. Teams are in on Senga because the money is not prohibitive and he has a high ceiling. So he is a good buy low candidate. And you look at the market, there's just not a lot of starting pitchers that you could have at the salary that it's going to take to bring Senga on the books. Like to get a guy on just a 1 or 2 year commitment at $14 to $15 million per season, those guys are few and far between. And we'll talk about them more in the final segment when we get into the idea of should the Mets just keep Senga. there just really is not many guys in that price bucket that are good bets. And I think what you would be looking for from a Mets perspective of getting off of Senga to sign a different pitcher in that $15 million range is you just be looking to get a pitcher that had a higher floor, a guy that you know is going to make his starts and going to be in the rotation. David Stearns was already quoted saying it would be foolish to expect Kodai Senga to make 30 starts this year. But what if you can find a trade where you can move off of Senga, get the contract off your books, clear a roster spot, clear a spot in that rotation, and then you can get a piece back that helps you in 2026? That's still the best case scenario here, where there is a team that looks at Senga and says, that is our best bet. We don't have $30 million to spend in free agency, so we can pick up this guy and we can give the Mets something else back. We can trade from an area of depth on our roster to pick up Kodai Senga, and we'll take a gamble that he is going to be the answer for us. So if there's that team that is out there that has something to offer the Mets that helps them in 2026, yeah, it's a trade you have to consider. But if you're getting nothing of value back, if you're just getting prospects but largely salary relief, is it really worth moving them? That is the dilemma the Mets are going through right now. That's what they have to decide this offseason. What I want to talk about in the next segment is which teams would be in and what could you realistically get back in a Kodai Senga trade. So we're going to go through all of that in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or you just want to ride that hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. All right, let's talk a little bit about what the Mets could get in a Kodai Senga trade. Now, I did this on an episode back on November 20th, so not that long ago. But the conclusion that I came to on that podcast was that the best possible outcome with the Kodai Senga trade chip was for the New York Mets to use it to reel in Sonny Gray. And the thought process was the Cardinals are going to have to eat down that contract if they want to move him to a different team. So this would be an opportunity for a team that typically doesn't eat down salary to pick up a player in Senga that has a lot of upside, who's going to cost less. At the time, Sonny Gray was still owed $40 million between a $35 million salary in 2026 and a $5 million buyout on a mutual option for 2027 that was worth, I think, $30 million. So my thought process was you send Senga to the Cardinals, you get Sonny Gray back, and you take on all the money that relieves a big financial burden for the Cardinals. They get a guy in Kodai Senga who could still headline their rotation at a much cheaper price tag. And if he's great and they're not in the race, then they could move Senga for a much better prospect return than they would get by trading Gray. Now, they ultimately get a pitching prospect in, what was his name? Apologies to whoever that was. Brandon Montgomery. I don't even remember. But regardless, they got a left-handed pitching prospect from the Red Sox who has a good fastball and a good slider, but was coming off of injury last year and only pitched I want to say it was 38 innings and 14 starts. So a high upside arm that still has a lot to prove. And they got a guy in Richard Fitz who can slide into the rotation immediately, but not the highest of upside arms. I would think a pretty good comp would be Jonathan Pintaro for the Mets. So a guy that throws hard, maybe he can pick up some strikeouts, maybe he can survive, but probably more of a swing man in the big leagues. Not the best of returns, especially when you consider the fact that the Cardinals ate half of the contract. They gave $20 million to the Red Sox to get that return. So I thought it was a good trade. Whether that was ever on the table or not, who knows? Maybe the Cardinals are on Kodai Senga's no trade list. Maybe they just wanted to get off of Gray, get some young, controllable pieces into their organization, and that was all that mattered. Bottom line, the guy that I talked about for a majority of that past Kodai Senga show, he's off the table. So the other teams that I spotlighted on that show that I thought made sense as Kodai Senga landing spots, the Padres, the Diamondbacks, the Astros, and the Giants, they all theoretically could still use an arm. And I think outside of the Giants, none of those teams that I just listed are going to be able to spend at the top of the market to address their rotation. The Padres and the Astros in particular seem like teams that might trust their ability to, well, I'd say the Astros might trust their ability to get more out of Kodai Senga. I think the Padres, while, yeah, that's part of it, I think they're just a team that is always looking at upside. And AJ Preller is always going to gamble. So I still see the Padres as a fit just because the salary is palpable for the Padres and you can slide them into the rotation. But the Padres don't have a lot they can trade for Kodai Senga. Neither do the Astros. Neither do the Diamondbacks. And what are they going to give up for a guy that finished last season in AAA? Another team I would add to the mix is the Baltimore Orioles because they do need a frontline arm and they might not spend at the top of the market. But again, what are you going to get? With the Astros, a trade chip that I mentioned on the last show was Steven Okert, who is a left-handed reliever who had a 3.01 ERA this past season in a little over 70 innings. Not the greatest of strikeout artists, although he did have an uptick in strikeouts this past season. Only 1 year of control, but a cheap left-handed reliever that had a lot of success last year, where you're basically just getting off of Sanga and picking up a reliever to slot into your bullpen. With the Giants, maybe you trade for Jose Butto and get Butto back. I'm only half joking when I say that, but honestly, I just don't know what the Giants have. And I almost feel like that's what you're looking for is just, hey, get a reliever. Get a cost-controlled reliever. Maybe you get a couple years of control, or maybe you just get a really good reliever that doesn't have a ton of control, where a team just says, all right, we'll trade a reliever for a starter because we want to believe in Sanga. These are the types of trades that I think you're trying to find right now. For the Padres, I love Adrian Morejon, but this was one of, if not the best left-handed reliever in baseball last year, 2.08 ERA. I think you'd probably have to trade something on top of Kodai Senga to get Morejon, or you'd have to maybe eat some salary and make Senga super attractive to the Padres to get Morejon. Wandy Peralta, I think, is a way more likely trade candidate. And he's been a very consistent left-hander reliever that the New York Mets did have interest in before he signed that deal with the Padres, and it was a 4-year deal that is going into year 3 of. So it would have been David Stern's regime that was in on Peralta. I could actually see that trade happening, honestly, where you're getting off of Sanga and you're getting a guy, Wandy Peralta, that you like that slides into your bullpen who's probably going to pitch to a sub-3.5 ERA. Not going to set the world on fire, but he's going to be consistent for you. The Orioles, I had a weird trade that I don't even know how much I want to follow. I don't know how far I want to go down the rabbit hole on for this one, but could you trade Kodai Senga for Tyler O'Neill and cash? I hate this trade, and I also like the upside of this trade. And look, Tyler O'Neill, when he's right, unbelievable. It's pretty much like a hitter version of Kodai Senga. It's a luxury car that always breaks down. Tyler O'Neill in 2024 played 113 games with the Red Sox, and he hit 31 home runs. In 2025, when he signed that 3-year deal that pays him north of $16 million per season with the Orioles, he went out, played 54 games, hit 9 home runs, was in a below average hitter, not a good defender, dealt with a neck injury, a shoulder injury, and a wrist injury. Still owed $16.5 million for 2 more seasons. He's 30 years old. Now, I'd almost think that because of Tyler O'Neill's negative trade value compared to Sanga, who I'd say probably has more net neutral trade value, I'd almost wonder if the Orioles would have to kick in a prospect to make that work, or if they would have to kick in some salary or something. It's a crazy trade, but the only way that I think that you make that trade is if it's February and maybe you already picked up 2 starting pitchers and you haven't found a deal for Sanga and you just want to move him somewhere and you still haven't landed a corner outfielder and you say, all right, we'll bet on Tyler O'Neill's upside, get him out of that ballpark in Baltimore that can be tougher on right-handed hitters, and see what we can do with him. Hopefully he's healthy and maybe you DH him a bunch. Those are the options, though. There's just not a lot of good options to trade Kodai Senga. I think maybe the best possibility is you have Senga going a trade where you're taking money back, similar to O'Neill, but maybe it is the trade for a starting pitcher. Maybe you trade Kodai Senga, and in the Sandy Alcantara trade, you throw Sanga in there as a guy that can fill Sandy's absence in the Marlins rotation, a guy that can potentially become a trade asset for you at the deadline the same way that Sandy can. And maybe you're getting, obviously prospects on top of Sanga to facilitate that move. That's one, because the Marlins aren't really trying to cut salary. They're just trying to have a better long-term sustainable future. So you'd have to make the future value worth it. But that's one type of a trade. You can do the exact same thing with Pablo Lopez, who's making some money, where you trade Sanga for Lopez, offsets the salary a little bit for the Mets. And, maybe, from a Twins perspective, it's an additional piece that you get on top of prospects that, again, you hope that you can manufacture into another trade asset at the deadline. The one that's super interesting that I wanted to finish on for this segment: what if the New York Mets leverage their wallet with a team that needs to get off money, and they trade Kodai Senga to the Brewers for Freddy Peralta, and they eat a lot of the contract? Kodai Senga is not on a bad deal, but if the Brewers are trying to bring their overall payroll down a little bit, what if you traded Kodai Senga and $14 million along with Brandon Sproat and Ronnie Mauricio for Freddy Peralta, where maybe you're even eating down Senga's contract for this upcoming season significantly? You're sending $10 million for this upcoming season. So they go from $8 million in Freddy Peralta. They get Senga at $4 million. They get Brandon Sproat. So now they have the floor of Sproat in their rotation, plus the long-term upside. But just as far as the guy that you would think would be healthy, because Senga's just such a wild card, you get Sanga, and then you get a flyer bat on Ronnie Mauricio. I think if you traded for Peralta without Sanga, you're probably looking at having to give up a better position player prospect than Ronnie Mauricio to get a deal done. I think it's Brandon Sproat and Ryan Clifford. Maybe it's Brandon Sproat and Jacob Reimer, or Brandon Sproat and AJ Ewing, Brandon Sproat and Jet Williams. I think you have to give up a top pitching prospect and a top hitting prospect, because Peralta's making nothing. It's not the same as the Corbin Burnes trade, because Corbin Burnes got too expensive in arbitration as a former Cy Young. So the Brewers had to get off the money. With Peralta, they don't have to get off the money. And I said this on a show the other day. If I was hosting Locked On Brewers, I would be saying, don't trade Freddy Peralta. Just do nothing over trading Freddy Peralta, because Freddy Peralta is way more valuable on your team in 2026 than whatever you're getting back, and you have a team that can win a World Series next year. So I think you'd have to overwhelm the Brewers, and this would be a way where, if they like Kodai Senga and you're kicking in enough cash, you might be able to make it work where they say, you know what, let's do it. I mean, if the Mets want to get crazy, why not even eat $10 million a season on Kodai Senga? Who cares? If Freddy Peralta was a free agent, would you pay him $28 million for the upcoming season? The answer is yes, in a heartbeat. So you pay him $8 million, you pay Senga 10 this year and 10 next year, and you use that asset in a way that maybe is a little bit more creative. But that's such an unique type of trade. And while it's a fun idea, these types of fun ideas hardly ever actually come together in real time and become the trade that actually happens. So I just don't know if it's worth it to trade Kodai Senga, even though I understand why the Mets would do it. I'm just very torn on this, and that's what I want to talk about in the final segment. Is there any world where it just makes sense to just keep him? We'll go through that in a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. The NBA is back, and honestly, there's never been a better time to get into the arena surrounded by fans cheering on your team. But let's be honest, getting tickets, it can be a hassle between queues, login screens, prices that can jump at checkout. It gets frustrating, but that's why I use Game Time, because it's the app that gives the advantage back to fans. Game Time, it's fast, it's easy, and it's backed by the Game Time guarantee. So you're always going to get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all fees are included. So the price you see is the price you pay. The app's made it super simple. You can view your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And it could not be easier to get your tickets with Game Time. It's the fastest, cheapest, and least stressful way I've ever gone about getting tickets for a game. So if you want to try it, if you're going to a game soon, download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONMLB, LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. If you're an everydayer that always tunes into the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. It's our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime, take part in our Locked On Mets signed photo giveaways, and get a live graphic sent to your phone each day so you know who's in the starting lineup during the regular season without ever having to go on social media. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. All right, so let's talk about Kodai Senga and what the alternative is if you move him. Let's just say you're trading Sanga for prospects. You get an 18-year-old arm and an 18-year-old shortstop, and that's it. You're just getting far away prospects. You're not getting any piece coming back that helps you in 2026. You're not getting a reliever. You're not getting a corner outfielder. You're not using Sanga to trade for a starting pitcher. It is simply, we want to move off of Kodai Senga. We want somebody else to pay his salary. So we found this team that's willing to take on the money, and we're just shipping them off. If that is the situation the Mets are in, what do they do after making the Senga trade? We have talked about all of the options for this offseason. Free agency. I like Framber Valdez on a 4-year contract, ideally. Definitely not a 6-year contract, but I talked about that over the weekend. There is an argument to be made for signing Framber Valdez because he would be the best guy in free agency for your 2026 rotation. He is, if you're looking for a high floor, he's one of the highest floor arms in baseball. A great ground ball pitcher who would play very well with the New York Mets, especially now that you have formed a double play combination of Marcus Semien and Francisco Lindor. Framber Valdez would be getting himself out of a lot of jams with those two turning double plays behind him. So I like that as a potential fit because of the floor. I don't love the idea of this being the guy that you give the long-term deal to when Tarek Skubal and Freddy Peralta are going to be free agents next offseason. I'd rather get a stopgap and then pick up Skubal or Peralta in free agency next year, then commit long-term to Framber, but I still get the merits in signing him. You have Tatsuya Imai, who is the pitcher coming over from Japan. This could be another little wrinkle to the Kodai Senga thing, as there has been some reports that Imai wants to be the sole Japanese star on a team. So maybe he wouldn't want to be overshadowed by Kodai Senga if Senga was healthy and effective for whatever that's worth. So that could be another reason to move off of Senga. And look, if you're getting Imai, fine, I get it. But that's one option. You have Michael King, who I've talked about as probably my favorite of the free agent starters. I think he's a high upside arm that you probably could get on a 3-year deal with an opt-out. And that's really where I would be looking right now in free agency. But if you sign one of those guys, are you also making a trade for a top starting pitcher? Are you also trading top prospect when you're going to give up a couple draft picks to get a Michael King or a Framber Valdez? Are you then going to, on top of that, trade Brandon Sproat and Jet Williams for Freddy Peralta if the Brewers even move him? Are you going to meet what is probably going to be an astronomical price to get Joe Ryan from the Twins, who's still cheap and has multiple years of control? Are you going to trade for Pablo Lopez or Sandy Alcantara? What I don't know is if the Mets would really be willing to sign a top free agent and trade for one. I think it would be more likely that they're either going to pull off the big trade or they're striking out in the trade market. They're not finding a deal that makes sense. So they jump on the market of one of these free agent starting pitchers. And if that's the case, if you're not going to do both, then what's the point of moving Sanga? What are you trying to do? I get the idea of you have to move Sanga to pick up a second starting pitcher, but my question then becomes, who is that second starting pitcher? Because when you look at this free agent class, you got the two guys I already talked about as far as the guys who pitched in the big leagues last year, Framber and King. Ranger Suarez has a qualifying offer attached. Zach Gallen has a qualifying offer attached. Dylan Cease had a qualifying offer attached, signed with another team, and then Shota Imanaga and Brandon Woodruff both picked up qualifying offers. All of these top guys had qualifying offers with the draft picks attached. Doesn't mean that you don't sign them, but I don't think you're going to get two of them. That's for sure. So then if you go beyond that tier in free agents to the other guys, if the Mets traded Sanga because they were going to pick up Freddy Peralta or one of those top starting pitchers in the trade market, they're going to pick up one of the top free agents. And then the second arm they're getting is Merrill Kelly. I'm all in. Merrill Kelly has a very high floor. I would definitely want I would definitely want Merrill Kelly on my team rather than Kodai Senga next season. But you're probably going to pay Merrill Kelly even more than Kodai Senga makes. And what if Merrill Kelly at 37 years old, because of the lack of option on this market, finds a team that gives him a 3-year deal? Would I want any part of that? Would I even want any part of Merrill Kelly on a 2-year deal? I mean, yes, I would do it, but you're talking about age 37 and age 38 of Merrill Kelly. Who knows if he's going to continue what he's done, which has been being one of the more effective pitchers in Major League Baseball. The other options, you got former Mets on the market: Chris Bassett, Jose Quintana, Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander. Any of those guys going to come back to New York? Especially Bassett and Quintana, who hit the market after good seasons with the Mets and were completely ignored. The Mets did not pursue either of those guys. Are they now going to want to come right on back? Lucas Giolito, Tyler Mahle, good pitchers with upside, just as much risk as Kodai Senga when it comes to injury. You want to bet on a bounce back from Dustin May and Walker Buehler, Aaron Savali, and Zach Eflin? I'd rather bet on Senga over any of those arms. So when you start to look at it that way, when you start to look at the other options that are below that ace tier, unless the New York Mets are committed to picking up a top trade target and a top free agent, and to do that, they have to trade Senga, there is part of me that thinks this team is better off just getting the best possible pitcher they can with the highest possible floor. So trading for Freddy Peralta, signing Framber Valdez, and then rolling with Sanga as the high upside guy that you never know what you're going to get. I mean, I understand not going into free agency, signing Michael King and saying, all right, we're good. We're going to roll through a rotation of Michael King coming off a season where he had a shoulder injury. We're going to have Kodai Senga, who was, complete disaster in the second half and now has 2 injury-plagued seasons in a row. We're going to, trust that Minai is going to have a bounce back. We got David Peterson after he looked awful at the end of the season. And you got Clay Holmes, who just had a 100-inning jump in workload, trying to do it again as a starting pitcher. Yeah, we're going to roll with all that because we still got McClain and these other young starting pitchers that can help buoy the rotation if all the veterans fail. That's too much risk. I get it. If Michael King's the guy that you sign, yeah, you probably should trade Kodai Senga, and then you should still go out and get some form of a higher floor pitcher, whether that is trading for a guy or, if you sign Michael King and Merrill Kelly and trade Senga, I can get on board with that. That makes some sense. But I think where I stop short on a lot of these deals, and it's the same conversation through a different lens, I guess, with Jeff McNeil, where I think there are a lot of Mets fans who are just pissed off. You're pissed off at how the season ended. You're pissed off at these same faces that you've been watching year over year disappoint you. You're pissed off that Kodai Senga, after he was the runner-up for Rookie of the Year and top 5 in Cy Young voting in 2023, only made 1 start in 2024, was a disaster in the playoffs, and then made you believe in 2025 just to be a huge failure in the second half. And you're just sick of the guy. You're just sick of Jeff McNeil because he's been around forever, and every time he strikes out, he slams the bat, and he's just an annoying player to follow. I get the frustration, but if the alternative, if you are just trading these guys to get off of them, but you're not bringing in a better player, then what is the point? Just to move them? I don't really subscribe to that. And I've made the case enough for McNeil. I don't have to do it again as far as what he can bring to the Mets and why the alternatives aren't that great. The same is true with Kodai Senga. This is a bad market for starting pitching. And you have a guy in Kodai Senga that has, I hate to say it, but ace potential when he's healthy. I get that there is so much risk. I get it. But for the money that you have invested in him, which is not that much, I think that's a risk that's a little bit more worth taking than dumping him so that you can take a flyer on Tyler Mahle or Lucas Giolito. It just, when you look at Major League Baseball, there are only a handful of guys that have a 80 grade pitch. And if you're not familiar with the scouting scale of grading players, the 20-80 scale is how they grade a prospect. So they'll grade a fastball from a 20 to the low end to 80 is the highest end. And an 80 grade anything is nearly impossible to get to. Kodai Senga's Ghost Fork is an 80 grade pitch. It is one of the most elite split finger fastballs in baseball. The Ghost Fork is that good. He still has his velocity. He still has, over the past year, a stretch where it was 13 big league starts where he pitched to a sub 1.5 ERA. That upside is still present. The risk is immense. But when you have this many top pitching prospects that are either at the big league level or close to it, with McLean, who's ready to go, Sproat, who I think is ready to go, Jonah Tong, who I think needs some seasoning in AAA, but with a good offseason, a good spring training, and a good first month in Syracuse, he could be ready. Christian Scott coming off injury, and we were as high on Christian Scott before he went down as any of these guys before McLean showed up. And then you also have Jonathan Pintaro, who has really good stuff. He's on your 40. You have still, for now, Hageman and Waddell. Not that you went to those guys starting. You have Jack Wenninger and Jonathan Santucci that both could end up in AAA very soon into this upcoming season. There is so much depth in this organization that if you pick up the right starting pitcher this offseason, whether that's Framber, whether that's trading for Peralta, whether that is signing Tatsuya Imai, and he's okay playing with Sanga, keeping Kodai Senga as a high upside wild card is not the worst thing in the world. You don't have to trade this guy if you're not getting anything back in return. I'll tell you right now, if you can trade Kodai Senga and get a good reliever for your bullpen, I'd do it in a heartbeat. If you can trade Kodai Senga as part of the package for a better starting pitcher for your upcoming rotation, I would do it in a heartbeat. And the same goes if you can get a competent bat that helps your lineup. I just don't know what the market is for Kodai Senga. And so I'm very curious if they move him, what that return is going to be. It's nice to know that he wants to stay. I don't think that impacts the New York Mets decision-making whatsoever. Brandon Nimmo bought a house in Port St. Lucie, built a house in Port St. Lucie for team functions as the team leader, and they dealt him. What that trade did is it let everybody know the New York Mets are not holding on to sentiment and they're open for business. It sent a message to a guy like Kodai Senga that now is telling the Mets, oh, please don't trade me. It sent a message to Pete Alonso and Edwin Diaz in free agency of, hey, we're not just going to overpay because we love you and the fans love you. We're going to pay you your market value and then we'd like to have you. And that no nonsense sentiment that was sent out there that we're going for it, we're going to win now, and we don't really care whose feelings we might hurt along the way, it makes the whole story about Senga wanting to stay a complete non-factor. But it was a good segue to talk about this guy because he is still one of the more fascinating pieces that the Mets have right now, one of the more interesting shoes that's left to drop this offseason, and anything can happen at any time. The Nimmo trade taught us that. Anyway, that's going to be all for this edition of Locked On Mets. Appreciate all of you who tuned in and stayed along for the whole ride. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network.